A quiet janitor, a powerful executive, and a lesson she never saw coming. The buzzing hum of fluorescent lights filled the pristine lobby of Redding and Burke, a towering symbol of corporate dominance in the heart of Dallas, Texas. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, and the building brimmed with polished shoes clicking on marble floors and muffled conversations about deadlines and profit margins. Among the hurried crowd, a man named Franklin quietly pushed his janitorial cart, his presence as unassuming as his neatly pressed grey uniform. Few ever looked him in the eye, and fewer still knew his name. Franklin, in his early 60s, moved with a quiet efficiency that belied a lifetime of experience. His eyes carried wisdom, though he rarely spoke beyond a polite "good morning" or "excuse me." To most employees he was just part of the scenery, a fixture in the background who emptied trash bins and wiped down desks. But Franklin saw everything. He listened. He noticed. And this morning, like clockwork, the day's chaos was about to begin. Upstairs in her corner office, Charlotte Bennett, the chief operating officer of Redding and Burke, was in her element. Draped in a designer suit, with perfectly styled blonde hair, she exuded confidence and control. To her colleagues, she was a powerhouse. To her subordinates, she was unapproachable, a storm waiting to happen. Charlotte had built her reputation on being relentless, but with that came a streak of arrogance and a blind spot for those she deemed beneath her. Franklin's day was uneventful until the moment he wheeled his cart onto the 18th floor. The air felt heavier there, not physically, but with an energy that was hard to ignore. Employees rushed past him, some whispering, others avoiding eye contact. Then, Charlotte's voice cut through the noise like a whip. She was on the warpath, and Franklin was about to be in her line of fire. But what she didn't know was that this quiet janitor wasn't as invisible as she thought. Franklin kept his head down, focusing on wiping the smudges off the glass panels near Charlotte's office. He could hear her voice, sharp, commanding, and tinged with irritation. "Why is this still sitting here?" Charlotte snapped, pointing at a small pile of recycling bins stacked awkwardly by the hallway corner. A junior assistant stammered an apology, fumbling with her tablet as Charlotte waved her off with an impatient gesture. "Get it together or you'll be packing your desk by the end of the day." Franklin didn't look up, but he felt the weight of her presence as she approached. He adjusted the angle of his cart, ensuring it wouldn't block the path. Yet, it wasn't enough. "Excuse me," she barked, her heels clicking to a halt beside him. Franklin straightened up, his cloth still in hand. "This cart has been sitting in the same spot for 5 minutes. Are you planning to move it, or are you just here to hold up progress?" He turned to face her, his expression calm. "I was just finishing up the panels, ma'am. I can move it right away." Her eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, do I look like someone who needs you to call me that? What I need is for you to do your job properly. This is a workplace, not a parking lot for your cart." Around them, a few employees dared to glance over, their curiosity outweighing their fear of being caught eavesdropping. Franklin's composure didn't falter, though his grip on the cloth tightened slightly. "I'll take care of it right now," he replied evenly. Charlotte wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a mocking tone. "I've seen your type before. You clock in, do the bare minimum, and expect a paycheck at the end of the week. But you're in my building, which means I expect better. Understand?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Franklin didn't respond right away, which only fueled Charlotte's frustration. "Well?" she pressed. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally, his tone polite but firm. He moved his cart down the hall without another word, the echo of her scorn still ringing in the air. Charlotte turned on her heel, satisfied she had made her point, and stormed back into her office. But the looks exchanged by the staff told another story. They'd witnessed yet another example of her condescension, and this time, the target had been someone who didn't deserve it. But Franklin wasn't angry, at least not in the way most would expect. Instead, he felt something deeper stirring. A quiet resolve that Charlotte would soon come to regret. The hum of the office resumed, as Charlotte disappeared into her glass-walled sanctuary, leaving the employees to exchange hushed comments. Franklin continued down the hallway, his cart rolling quietly over the polished floors. He wasn't one to let moments like this linger, at least not outwardly. But inside, a different story played out. Franklin wasn't just a janitor. In a previous life, he had been a professor at the University of Texas, teaching economics and business strategy. His career had been full of achievements, from authoring well-regarded papers to mentoring students who now held prominent positions across the country. But after retirement, he found himself restless. The thought of staying idle didn't sit well with him, so he took up this janitorial job, a role he found oddly grounding. What no one in the building realized was that Franklin still carried the sharp mind and discerning eye of a professor. He had an uncanny ability to observe, process, and understand the intricacies of any environment he entered. And in this corporate setting, he'd pieced together more about Redding and Burke than even some of the senior staff knew. Charlotte's arrogance had drawn his attention long before today's incident. Franklin had overheard more than a few conversations among executives and employees about her poor financial decisions. She had approved costly, unnecessary projects that drained resources and micromanaged teams into inefficiency. Whispers about the company's declining performance often circulated, but no one dared challenge Charlotte. Her temper and connections ensured silence. Today, as Franklin cleaned an empty conference room near the executive suites, he found his thoughts returning to the humiliation in the hallway. He wasn't angry for himself. He'd been through worse in his lifetime. But he couldn't ignore how Charlotte's behavior affected the workplace as a whole. As he replaced a trash liner, he heard voices filtering through the door. The thin walls did little to muffle the conversation inside the adjacent boardroom. Franklin paused, not intentionally eavesdropping, but he couldn't help catching fragments of the discussion. "We can't keep going like this," a male voice said. "Charlotte's last move put us in a corner. The budget's stretched thin, and if we don't find a way to fix it, the shareholders are going to revolt." A second voice, softer but equally concerned, added, "No one wants to cross her. She'll bury anyone who tries." Franklin moved away, his mind now buzzing with ideas. He had no intention of seeking revenge, but he couldn't ignore the opportunity to address the deeper issue at hand. He knew the language of business. More importantly, he knew how to present facts in a way that demanded attention. For now, though, he stayed silent, waiting for the right moment. That evening, Franklin returned home to his modest apartment. He pulled out an old notebook and began writing, sketching out figures and potential scenarios based on what he'd overheard and observed. His hands moved with precision, just like they had during his teaching days. By the time he closed the notebook, a plan had taken shape. But Franklin wasn't looking for personal gain. He wanted something far more valuable, to remind people like Charlotte that power didn't excuse arrogance, and wisdom didn't always wear a suit. The day of the monthly executive meeting arrived. The tension in the building was palpable as department heads filed into the grand conference room on the 20th floor. Charlotte, as always, took her seat at the head of the table, radiating authority. She adjusted her gold pen and glanced at the agenda, ready to assert her dominance over yet another session. Franklin was on his usual route, cleaning windows near the conference room. The doors were partially ajar, and from his vantage point, he could see Charlotte gesturing forcefully, while others around the table exchanged uneasy glances. He knew what was happening. She was bulldozing her way through the discussion, shutting down any dissent. Inside, the CFO hesitated before speaking up. "Charlotte, with all due respect, the expansion project in Miami has exceeded its initial budget by 30%. If we continue—" Charlotte cut him off sharply. "We're not here to discuss the past, Greg. We need solutions, not finger-pointing. Does anyone have a constructive suggestion?" Silence followed. No one dared challenge her. Franklin's eyes narrowed as he continued to wipe the glass, his mind racing. The opportunity he'd been waiting for was here. Minutes later, the meeting paused for a break. As the executives filed out, Franklin seized the moment. Rolling his cart toward the room, he entered casually, as though intending to clean. But instead of heading to the trash can, he walked to the presentation screen and placed his notebook on the table. "Excuse me, Miss Bennett," Franklin said, his voice steady but commanding enough to draw attention. Charlotte turned, her expression a mix of surprise and irritation. "I believe I have something that might help with your budget concerns." The room fell silent. Some of the executives exchanged shocked glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment play out. Charlotte stared at him, disbelief etched across her face. "I'm sorry, are you under the impression that this is a brainstorming session for custodial staff?" Franklin smiled faintly. "No, ma'am, but I do think you'll want to hear this." Without waiting for her permission, Franklin flipped open his notebook and began explaining. He spoke clearly and concisely, outlining the financial inefficiencies he'd observed and offering actionable solutions. His analysis was sharp, his language professional, and his demeanor calm but confident. He referenced real numbers and trends, connecting dots that had eluded even the seasoned executives in the room. Charlotte's initial expression of annoyance shifted to one of disbelief. As Franklin spoke, the CFO leaned forward, nodding subtly. "He's right," Greg murmured, almost to himself. "That's the pattern I've been trying to explain." Franklin continued, his tone unwavering. "Your Miami expansion, for instance, could have been scaled back to focus on high-yield areas. Instead, resources were stretched too thin, and the return on investment has been negligible. But there's still a way to salvage it." The executives listened intently, their earlier skepticism replaced by intrigue. Charlotte, however, was fuming. "How do you know any of this?" she demanded, her voice tight. Franklin met her gaze without flinching. "I listen, I observe, and I care about the work being done here, even if it's not my name on the office door." The room was electric, the balance of power subtly shifting. For the first time, someone had not only stood up to Charlotte, but done so with undeniable authority and precision. Greg broke the tension by turning to Charlotte. "We should discuss this further. Franklin's insights could save us millions." Charlotte opened her mouth to protest, but found herself at a loss for words. She looked around the room, realizing that the tide was no longer in her favor. The very employees who once cowered under her gaze were now looking at Franklin with respect, and at her with doubt. But Franklin wasn't there to humiliate her. His goal was bigger, to show that wisdom and value could come from the most unexpected places. The silence that followed Franklin's presentation was deafening. The once dominant Charlotte seemed smaller in her seat, her usual sharpness dulled by the weight of the room's shifting energy. Franklin stood for a moment, scanning the room, and then calmly collected his notebook. "Thank you for listening," he said, his voice steady but warm. "I hope it helps." As he turned to leave, Greg, the CFO, stood. "Franklin," he called out, "would you mind staying a bit longer? I think your input could be valuable as we figure out next steps." Franklin hesitated, glancing at Charlotte, who looked as though she wanted to object, but was too stunned to find the words. He nodded politely and set his notebook back down. The discussion that followed was nothing short of transformative. Franklin outlined strategies to streamline operations, cut unnecessary expenses, and redirect funds toward projects with better potential returns. His insights, grounded in years of teaching and practical experience, were met with nods and notes from the executives. For once, the room felt collaborative, rather than dictated by fear. Charlotte's silence was noticeable, but not as surprising as her eventual outburst. "This is absurd," she snapped. "Are we seriously letting the janitor dictate company strategy now?" Greg responded before Franklin could. "He's not dictating, Charlotte. He's offering solutions we've been struggling to find for months." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Franklin, ever composed, turned to Charlotte. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "This isn't about titles or roles. It's about the success of the company. Sometimes, the best ideas come from places we least expect. Charlotte's face reddened, but she didn't respond. Her usual armor of authority seemed to crack under the weight of the moment. When the meeting finally ended, Franklin was approached by several executives, each thanking him for his contributions. Some shook his hand, others asked questions, eager to learn more about his background. Franklin answered humbly, emphasizing his desire to see the company thrive. Charlotte, however, stayed behind. As Franklin packed up his things, she approached him, her expression a mix of frustration and something softer, perhaps regret. "I don't know what game you're playing," she said quietly, "but you caught everyone off guard today." Franklin looked at her, his gaze steady. "No game, Miss Bennett. Just an opportunity to help. That's all I ever wanted." For a moment it seemed like she might say more, but instead she nodded curtly and walked away. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to one she could manage. But the day wasn't over for Charlotte, or Franklin. This encounter had set something much larger in motion, and neither of their lives would remain the same. In the weeks that followed, Redding and Burke began to change. Franklin's insights had not only saved the Miami expansion, but also spurred a company-wide reassessment of priorities. Efficiency improved, morale climbed, and for the first time in months, the board saw tangible progress. Franklin's contributions became the talk of the office, though he continued his janitorial duties with the same quiet humility. Charlotte, however, found herself on an unexpected journey. The incident with Franklin had shaken her deeply. For years, she'd defined herself by her title and power, equating her worth with her position at the top. But Franklin's calm defiance and undeniable wisdom had exposed cracks in her armor. She couldn't stop replaying his words. "Sometimes, the best ideas come from places we least expect." One afternoon, Charlotte approached Franklin in the lobby where he was polishing a brass railing. "Franklin," she began, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "I've been thinking about what you said, about titles and roles. I want to apologize for how I treated you." Franklin straightened and regarded her kindly. "Thank you, Miss Bennett. It's never too late to change." Her lips tightened, not in irritation, but in thought. "You've taught me more in one day than most have in years," she admitted. "If you ever decide to step out from behind that cart, I think there's a place for you in this company, officially." Franklin smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's a generous offer, but I'm happy where I am. Sometimes you don't need a title to make a difference." Charlotte nodded, her respect for him evident. As she walked away, she carried with her the first inklings of humility, a seed planted by a man she'd once dismissed without a second thought. The story of Franklin and Charlotte spread throughout the company, becoming a reminder of the importance of respect, humility, and the value of every individual, regardless of their role. Franklin remained a janitor, but to those who knew him, he was much more, a quiet force of change in the unlikeliest of places. And so, the lesson remains clear. Never underestimate someone based on their position or appearance. Wisdom and value often come from where we least expect. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring content. Thank you for watching.